nukes to Putin, celebrated by the left coast. Dun, 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 dun. Now she celebrates the collapse of LA. Dun, 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 dun. No one cares what you say anymore. These are our rights. No one cares how many books you come out or you crank out of your ass. Something like that. We never said that we would offer you another chance. You stretch the truth worse than the seams of your lady pants. You're still dead wrong. Go suck a schlong, and you can speak your mind. But not on prime time. No, that's weak. And you can speak your mind. Oh! While doing jail time. That's it. Okay. Okay, you're just working on a parody here for a good old hill dog. Doing jail time. All right, then, on with it. Welcome to the Sunder the Sky podcast. I am your host, Christopher Sky-Sunderer, coming to you from my fortified bunker deep beneath the seedy streets of Leftard, USA, commonly known as Kent, Ohio, and today we've got quite a show. Today is going to end up being one of the most, if not the most, important show I've ever done. One of two. We're going to talk about science. What science is, what science most definitely is not, and most especially how those who seek to rule us frequently pervert good science into bad, specifically for the purpose of misleading us. Today is actually going to be the first installment in a series of episodes that I'm going to do on this topic. There's a lot more to cover than I can do in one shot, and it's a problem that seems to only grow, often exponentially as time goes by. Next episode, we'll get right back into it, building on everything that I'm going to go over this time. After that, it's not going to be week after week I'm going to keep on this topic. It's going to be something I come back to periodically, okay? But the foundation of any episode that I ever do that focuses on science and how politicians use it to trick people is going to be laid in this episode and next week's episode, or the week after next. I'm not doing an episode Christmas week. So this episode and the next episode are the foundation of this kind of topic on this show, all right? But before we get into that, I also want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a good Yule for all my Norse brethren, all those who share the blood of the Vikings. Also a Happy Hanukkah and a very unsatisfying Kwanzaa, since that's not a real thing. Whatever it is that you do to celebrate this time of year, have a Sunderific holiday season. Okay? So, before we get going, in current events, this happened.
Do you have anything to add to these debates about just, in particular, the idea that it's kind of too expensive to deal with climate change?
I mean, it is, the money is there. If we can save the banks, then we can save the world. I mean...
So, hey, if we can save the banks, why can't we save the planet? Oh, Greta. Greta, I almost don't have the heart to tell you. Almost. Sweetheart, in spite of what Uncle Georgie the collaborator is telling you, there is not a force on God's earth that can save those banks. We're now on, like, the 15th renewal extension of the borrowed time that the banksters are living on. And a savage whirlwind has been waiting in the wings forever and is about to be reaped. Okay? So, my advice to you, Greta, enjoy your 5-star hotels, your private yacht rides, and your celebrity status predicated on the mourning of your stolen childhood while it lasts, because the people financing it have exactly as much real, valid wealth as they have credible scientific data, which is zero. And that brings me to today's topic. Okay, the first part of this that I want to go over today is I would like to cover with everybody the two types of scientific study. Okay? Now, this is obviously germane to the broader topic of today's show, but it's also useful far beyond today's topic. One of the really useful things about the scientific method is that the two broad types of scientific study they really highlight for us how people look for answers. All right? How people try to figure things out. Okay? They highlight in a big, broad way the two different ways that people reason. And if you understand the two different types of scientific studies, not just know what they are, but understand how they work, you'll be able to look at people's conclusions, arguments, etc., and you'll be able to assess very, very quickly whether they're on solid logical grounds or not. Okay? This is something that's been very useful to me in analyzing current events, philosophy, politics. So, there are two types of scientific study. The first is what's called an observational study. Now, observational studies are exactly what they sound like. We're just observing. All right, we're observing things that happen in a given environment, a given situation, a given group, etc. Okay? There's no intervention. There's no interaction on the part of the researchers with the subjects being studied. Whatever it is, whether it's people or phenomena or, weather patterns, whatever. All the researchers are doing in an observational study is observing and gathering data. What they're interested in noting are any phenomena, whether it's behaviors, occurrences, events, that seem to be associated. Other words for associated in this context are correlated, linked, etc. Okay? We're looking for things that seem to have occurred together and that tend to, or seem like they tend to occur together. Now, 99.9% of the time when you see a headline that says, like, coffee consumption linked to heart disease, or vaping associated with lung cancer risk, or studies suggest eating fruit linked with greater longevity, or whatever, 99.9% of the time you're looking at the results of an observational study. Now, the problem with that is observational studies cannot give you answers. Cannot. All an observational study is good for is for coming up with questions. Questions that we then attempt to answer with the other type of scientific study. Okay, and now to give you an example of how useless observational studies are for the purposes of drawing meaningful conclusions, for the purposes of coming up with answers. Okay, I'm going to steal an example from Tom Naughton. He's a libertarian. He's made a couple of documentaries, and I've actually attended speeches that he's given about this very topic. Okay, how science can be used to mislead the public. All right, this example is his, so full credit to him. If I were to conduct an observational study of all of the men in your city, okay, I could prove to you beyond the shadow of a doubt, absolutely, positively, that the size of a man's bald spot is correlated with the onset of heart disease. It's true. The size of a man's bald spot is absolutely linked to his risk for heart disease. That is not a lie. Now, in spite of that being true, does anybody within the sound of my voice actually believe that hair loss causes heart disease? No, of course not. That's nonsense. But hair loss and heart disease are most certainly associated, because both are phenomena that tend to occur as a man ages. Okay? So what what we're looking for there, age, is the missing variable, the missing factor that the investigators, the researchers, didn't see. And they didn't see it because they weren't looking for it. It's what's called a confounding variable in scientific research. Okay? And I love that example because it illustrates it perfectly. Observational studies are, just literally all of them, are filled with confounding variables. Factors that the researchers aren't thinking about. And if they're not thinking about them and not looking for a particular variable, they can't find it. You can't see something that you don't know is there when you're looking for information that's nebulous. Okay, if you're looking for, if you're just observing something, okay, I'm trying to think of a good way to put this. If I told you right now to go outside and for the next hour just count the number of birds you saw, okay, you would be able to come back and tell me the exact number. But what if I then asked, okay, and how many cars drove by during that same period of time? You would have no idea because you weren't looking for cars. Okay, do you understand what I'm saying? So this is why we get the expression correlation does not prove causation. That's where that saying comes from. What observational studies are useful for, and the reason they exist, and the reason they're practiced in science, is for developing questions to ask. Questions that via further research, the scientists will attempt to find answers for. Answers absolutely cannot be found with observational studies. To find answers to the questions observational studies give us, we have the other type of scientific study. And the other type of study is what's called a clinical study, also known as experimentation. In a clinical study, which is the gold standard of scientific inquiry, variables are under the direct control of the researchers. So we have different groups that we're looking at. We typically have what's called a control group and a variable group, right? And the groups are kept statistically the same. So let's say we're looking at two different groups of people. We're going to know the age, race, gender, socioeconomic status, everything we can think of, we're going to account for and make sure that we know it. Then the researchers will change one variable in one of the groups to find what effect it has, if any, on the group. Okay, for example, one group takes a drug, the other takes a placebo, and neither group knows which is which. Did we get the drug or the placebo? We don't know. Then, because we've controlled every single variable and changed that one, if those groups end up with a statistically significant different outcome, we know the difference is probably due to that one variable. And we don't know it for sure. We're going to have to do other tests. Now, a great example of this... Oh, and I want to note something else too. When I say statistically significant, because you hear that a lot, researchers trying to publish something and trying to come up with good headlines that are going to draw a lot of clicks, a lot of eyeballs, will use the term significant. Significant link between this and this. And they'll use that in terms of an observational study. They'll also use it when they have a clinical study that has shown results, but not really very big results. To make the results sound bigger than they are, they'll use the term significant. Now, when you hear the word significant in everyday conversation, you think, oh, that means important. All right, there's a significant effect on your car's gas mileage if you use this type of oil, right? You're going to think, oh, that means it's a big difference. Okay, and in everyday conversation, that's what it means. In scientific terms, all right, in the lexicon of scientific inquiry, all significant means is outside the margin of error. That's it. So if you have a margin of error that is 0.1%, any difference that you note that's 0.11%, okay, or just 0.11% or 0.101%, which is a minuscule deviation out of the margin for error, you can then factually say that's a statistically significant result. So the word significant in reference to anything scientific is not necessarily that significant. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's why one study is never enough, even if we're talking about experimentation. A great example of this, all right, and this is an example that Tom Naughton again has cited, okay, because it's a really good one, is the estrogen study that was conducted several years ago at, I think it was Harvard, okay? Based on the observational studies of middle-aged women who took estrogen, there was this big craze, GNC and what's that, oh God, one of those other vitamin and supplement stores, it's Nutri something. A lot of these health supplement companies were saying, estrogen can lower your risk for heart disease, in women as you age. Newspapers, health websites, okay, they all had, there were observational studies that were done to verify this, okay, these claims. Now, what's wrong with what I just said there? You can't verify anything with an observational study because you can't draw meaningful conclusions from an observational study. But there were several observational studies of middle-aged women who were taking these estrogen supplements. And it turns out, based on the observational studies, that the middle-aged women who took estrogen had 40% lower instances of heart disease. Okay, now, that's when newspapers, health websites, women's magazines, all ran with these findings. And doctors, this is the scariest part of this, doctors were all ready to run out and start prescribing estrogen to every middle-aged female patient they had, or every young female patient who was about to be middle-aged. Now, fortunately, in this instance, there were a number of good scientists who picked up on the stories and said, wait a minute, let's take this observational data and conduct some clinical studies, okay? And they did a study that was conducted over a period of 5 years. Again, I believe it was at Harvard, with thousands and thousands of women. And what they found was not only was estrogen not lowering the risk of heart disease, but that the women from the groups that took estrogen were experiencing 30% more heart disease. They were also having more strokes. Now, how could that be? If the observational studies showed us that middle-aged women who were taking estrogen had 40% lower instances of heart disease, why then did the clinical study show that women taking estrogen were at greater risk of heart disease and even at greater risk for stroke? Well, it was because of a confounding variable. And in this case, in the case of the Harvard estrogen study, the confounding variable was health consciousness. Yeah, the women from the initial observational studies who'd been taking estrogen, remember where they were getting it. They were getting it from GNC. They were getting it from pharmacies that sold health supplements. These were women who shopped at health supplement stores. Okay? They were taking estrogen because they'd read somewhere that it was good for them, and they had pill pushers at their local GNC telling them, hey, we've been reading good things about taking estrogen. If you're a middle-aged woman, this will lower your risk for heart disease. Well, as a natural matter of deductive logic, these were women who were more likely to be paying attention to that kind of thing. Women who read health journals, women who read health magazines, women who shopped at the nutritional supplement shops that carried the estrogen pills in the first place. These were naturally women who were health conscious, who got regular exercise. In addition to the fact that they were taking estrogen, they got regular exercise, they ate healthy diets, they got enough sleep each night, they were more likely to go to the doctor when they felt ill. The estrogen wasn't making them healthier. It was their improved health and their lower risk for heart disease was the natural aggregate effect of their much healthier lifestyle. The estrogen had nothing to do with it, because when we conducted clinical experimentation, we found the estrogen was increasing the risk of heart disease. The researchers found the women were even having more strokes. Now, I want you to imagine in that case, what would have happened if the doctors had followed their gut instinct, that knee-jerk reaction they had to all the bullshit health reporting from years prior, And they went back to their practices and started prescribing estrogen to women en masse. Thank God for those researchers that did those clinical trials. Where would we be without researchers doing that stuff? Just think about it. In this case, just in this case alone, we would have had an epidemic increase in heart disease in middle-aged women. Yeah, we dodged a bullet there. No. Let me rephrase that. We didn't dodge shit. We had some heroic scientists grab us and pull us out of the way of the bullet. You know, and I think about that story, and I think about my mom. I think about my aunts, and a lot of my friends who are middle-aged women that I know and love. And it makes me wonder, because these studies were conducted, I think it was 20 years ago, just about 20 years ago, how many of them would no longer be with us? If those scientists hadn't interceded on our behalf, would my mom still be alive? It's chilling. And that brings me to the bad news. Yeah, it doesn't always happen that way. Those scientists in the red boots and capes don't always swoop in to save the day. There's a lot more bullshit than there are good scientists in the world, okay? Let me just put it that way. There have been some much bigger bullets that we, society, didn't dodge. And this makes me think about people I have lost, that I wonder if I didn't have to. Now, in almost every case of this, when we don't dodge a bullet, the culprit upon whom we can fix the blame, in almost every case, you guessed it, the government. Your government, ladies and gentlemen. And believe me, I'm going to explain how that is and go into that in much greater detail soon, okay? In the next episode of the show, actually, which is going to center, I'm going to focus a little bit more on my own health issues, and I'm going to get into the topic that way. One of the biggest issues that I face, or rather one of the biggest areas of my health concerns, is directly affected by not only the negligence of government oversight of the medical industry, but the direct influence of government corruption in that oversight. Don't misunderstand me. I am not at all unique in this. When I say, this is not my problem. This is our problem. This is everyone's problem, because I promise you that you and everyone you know have been directly impacted by this. We'll go into that next time. But for the purpose of today's topic, I want to reference for you something that I consider a kind of secular Bible that I, as a man with numerous health concerns, as I've just mentioned, live by when dealing with medical professionals. About 10 years ago, there was an article published in The Atlantic. The title was Lies, Damned Lies, and Medical Science. I'll have a link to this in the description box below this video. People, read this article. Then go back and read it again. And then I want you to share it with everyone you know. The tagline of the article: much of what medical researchers conclude in their studies is misleading, exaggerated, or flat out wrong. That sentence is one that I've memorized, and I keep that sentence in my mind every single time I'm speaking with a doctor, a nurse, a medical insurance advisor. Let me say it again. Learn this, memorize it, and never let it fall out of your brain, okay? Quote, much of what medical researchers conclude in their studies is misleading, exaggerated, or flat out wrong. To continue, so why are doctors, to a striking extent, still drawing upon misinformation in their everyday practice? Dr. John Ioannidis has spent his career challenging his peers by exposing their bad science. This article was written by a medical journalist named David Freeman as a kind of case study of a Harvard MD, scientist, and a mathematical genius named Dr. John Ioannidis. Okay? He's what's known as a meta-researcher. This guy, with a staggering IQ, researches research. He's made a career out of combing through established medical research and findings to mathematically locate mistakes, falsified data, and omissions. He looks for the confounding factors that Others either failed to find, failed to look for, or, and this scares me the most, found and chose to ignore. All right, now, for him, it began for him, I think just around the turn of the century, 2000, 2001. Ioannidis, as you can imagine, is a Greek name. In Greek hospitals, okay, in Greece they had, at that time for years, they had this influx of Albanian immigrants, okay? Now, Albanians didn't speak the language particularly well, and they all needed medical care they couldn't afford. So in Greek hospitals, there were rumors that surgeons in residence, internists, etc., in other words, surgeons who weren't getting paid much because they hadn't racked up enough surgery time yet and were looking for ways to get more surgery time so they could go out and start earning money. There were rumors that those surgeons in residence and internists were misdiagnosing a number of these Albanian immigrants with appendicitis. Okay? Appendicitis, an appendectomy is a real simple, straightforward, easy surgery that takes time. Okay, an appendectomy takes a while, so, and it's an easy routine surgery, so it was an easy way for these internists and resident surgeons to rack up, what they call scalpel time. All right? Here's a quote, okay? He and his team have shown again and again, speaking about Dr. Ioannidis, they have shown again and again and in many different ways that much of what biomedical researchers conclude in published studies, that's not just studies published to news websites, they're talking about medical journal articles, medical journal studies that have been published. This is stuff that doctors all over the world read. Conclusions that doctors keep in mind when they prescribe blood pressure medicine or when they advise us to consume more fiber or less meat, that much of what those biomedical researchers conclude in those studies is misleading, exaggerated, and often just wrong. He charges that as much as, oh my God, my stomach drops every time I read this. He charges that as much as 90% of the published medical information that doctors rely on is flawed. If you've known me for any length of time, if you followed me on Facebook, you know I bitch about doctors all the time. And this right here is why. Doctors are relying on information that 90% of the time is flawed. And they do it not because they've done the research themselves. They haven't. That's why those medical journals exist. They're doing it because they're being guided by charts, graphs, and guidelines published by the insurance companies that they really work for, if you know what I'm getting at. Okay, and this all runs back to the fact that those insurance companies, the people in charge of those medical insurance companies, health insurance companies, they all have this habit of frequenting brothels. Okay, they go to this big whorehouse that goes by the common name government. Okay, and they write the regulations and give them to their whores to pass in Congress and to present for legislative proposal that then dictates what the doctors have to do. Okay, so the doctors in large part have to rely on this information. Okay, going back to this quote, when it came to cancer, heart disease, and other common ailments, there was plenty of published research, but much of it was remarkably unscientific, based largely on observations. 80% of non-randomized studies, that's observational studies, the most common type, 80% of observational studies turn out to be wrong. Researchers were frequently manipulating data analyses, chasing career-advancing findings rather than good science, and even using the peer review process to suppress opposing views. This is why I yawn and move on whenever I hear someone, this is based on peer-reviewed science. Fuck you. The peer review process is completely corrupted in the scientific community. If someone is building their career chasing a particular theory, there is an immense incentive for them to manipulate their findings pursuant to proving that theory. And they'll use this process, they'll use peer review to suppress opposing views. Okay? And once again, this goes back to that big problem called government. So, the point of all this is when you hear or read the word study or research in association with any kind of theory or idea, or most especially policy or law, the very first thing to look for is which of the two types of study was it, observational or clinical? Was there experimentation involved or not? Then the very next thing to look for is who conducted the study, then who is forwarding it as evidence supportive of their agenda, and then finally, why. Okay? And again, this particular part of today's show we're going to get into a lot more next time. And when I go into a subject we'll just call why the government needs to stay the fuck out of science. Okay? But that's for next time. Alright, so no listener questions this time. I know I haven't been doing it very long, so people haven't caught on and started to send them in yet. Remember, guys, you can submit your questions to me via private message on Facebook or post them to the Sunder the Sky Facebook group. Okay? But I did want to reheat something from last time. Brian asked a great question last week that I want to say a few more things about. I was mulling this over a couple days ago, and, you know, just really quickly for those who don't know, he was asking about my take on the state's reaction to the possibility of fourth-generation warfare tactics employed by private citizens, by non-state actors, okay? And for those who don't know, fourth-generation warfare is war and politics are kind of seen as just the same thing. So anything you do politically is then considered a warfare tactic, and anything you do in war, like anything violent you do, is just considered political. Okay, it's all just, you know, as Clausewitz said, war is a continuation of policy by other means. Now, that's not, okay, that wasn't Clausewitz trying to justify war. Okay, I'm using his quote completely wrong here. I'm just using it because the words are right. Okay, he certainly wasn't talking about fourth generation warfare. Clausewitz's point was that war in and of itself is always pointless and morally wrong. Okay, war is destruction of capital and people on both sides, and that is never a solution to a problem. I'm just using his quote facetiously. Okay, so he who chooses war is always wrong by default, according to von Clausewitz. But, okay, what occurred to me when I was thinking a bit more about your question, Brian, was that something important to keep in mind is that not only are we already at war, and this goes back to what Clausewitz was saying, that he who chooses war is automatically wrong because war is just pointless destruction of people and capital, and that doesn't solve anything. Okay, we haven't chosen it. And not only are we already at war by fourth generation warfare standards, but the state, and in particular the Democrats, started it over a century ago. They've been really good at convincing us it's not war. But everything that the Democrats have done in government, particularly federally, for the last 100 years, has been a direct assault, any way you slice it, on the rights, liberties, and property, and even upon the lives of the American people, okay? And there are casualties. People, you know, the changes that they made to the healthcare system with Obamacare, no one's actually done the math on this yet, but someone will eventually figure out exactly how many people died as a direct result of the ACA going through, okay? How many people have died in Flint, Michigan because we can't fix the water up there? And that's a Democrat-run area, okay? Everything that they've done that takes property and means of production and resources away from private citizens needlessly. And holy shit, is there a lot of obviously needless... Everything the government does is needless, okay? It's just how obvious is it is the only question. And, I mean those are casualties of fourth-generation warfare conducted by the Democrats for over a century now, okay? Take militarization of the police, okay, which I talked about last time, goes all the way back to the 50s and 60s. It's only now that they have armored vehicles and automatic rifles, and assault choppers and all that. It started with the way the training of the police was changed in response to the civil rights protests and race riots, right? So you've got that, militarization of the police. That goes back 60 years, that you've got legislation via the courts, okay, legislating from the bench, which our federal court system is not supposed to do. They do it anyway. And it's always the leftist justices that do it. Regulatory capture. I mean, I could give you example after example of this. Trying to weaponize voting and to enlist financially dependent people as conscripted foot soldiers / ammunition to that end as voters is what the Democratic Party has always been about. This is what the big city bosses did. They welcomed immigrants into the big cities, and it was always some Democrat mayor or governor who was a big city boss who said, let all these immigrants in. I'm going to get them housing. I'm going to get them food. I'm going to get them health care. All right. And then they would send, what do they call them? Roustabouts, thugs into, like, if there was a vote, they would go to the tenement houses where all these immigrants were housed. They would send their thugs to go in and kick the doors in and drag people out. Why are you here? Why aren't you voting? You get in there and you vote for whoever. Who do you think is giving you this house? Who do you think's giving you this food? That's literally what they did. They were weaponizing voting, weaponizing democracy, and enlisting, conscripting poor immigrants as their foot soldiers and, like I said, their ammunition. Okay? It's what the Democratic Party's always been about. That's why they're the Democratic Party. They're the party of democracy, because they're the party that uses the democratic process as their biggest and their main cudgel to hold on to political power. And this is the same way that a communist state thinks of its soldiers in a literal war. A communist state looks at its soldiers in exactly the same way that the Democratic Party looks at its voter base. Cannon fodder. It doesn't matter what happens to them. In fact, the more miserable they are, the harder they're going to fight, or in this case, the more faithfully they're going to vote. Party ticket. Right? This is one of the things that drives them so nuts about Donald Trump. Andrea, my friend, she sent me a message saying, you know what I love about Donald Trump? Because Andrea's like me. She's a voluntarist. She's an anarchist. A true libertarian to the core, right? Why do we like Donald Trump? Why do we like a president? If that's what we're about. Well, because he pisses off the people who are dyed-in-the-wool authoritarian statists, people who would be the next Stalin or the next Mao if they could. And the reason he pisses them off so much, one of the many reasons, okay, is he's getting all of those minorities to the point where they're not so miserable anymore. And maybe they're not going to keep voting left. Candace Owens, whatever you may think of her politics, her position, whatever, she's absolutely right. There's this mass exodus of blacks from the Democratic Party right now. That is also starting to happen in the Hispanic community. That's why the Democrats, look at this. We all know how the Democrats and how leftists in general try to influence everything through media, right? Go back to one of the more recent seasons of the show Archer. For anybody who watches Archer, there's an episode where they're supposed to catch this lady who smuggles immigrants over the Mexican border, and they're arguing with, Lana and Archer are arguing, and he's like, how can you be against immigration? And Lana's like, because illegal immigration, I just don't want to pay for their health care and their food and all this. All right, she's a very left-wing character. That episode of that show came out just a few years ago. It was literally just a few years ago that all of a sudden the Democratic Party did this full heel turn and say, no, we shouldn't be trying to stop illegal immigration. Everybody knows what I'm talking about here. You can find clips of Barack Obama while he was president, which, oh, by the way, was only 3 years ago, talking about how illegal immigrants should be sent back. And people who are willing to do the process right and come here legally, all right, they should be coming here to work and build a better life, not just to get on the welfare dole, right? And all of a sudden they realized, oh shit, more and more, I mean, ever since the internet existed, I honestly believe the Democratic Party's days have been numbered. Okay, because there's just no way to stop information from circulating. The problem now is learning to discern good information from bad. And that's part of why I'm doing this science series. It's just like I talked about earlier when I said just understanding the difference between the two different types of scientific studies. If you understand the fundamentals of them, you will start to understand, because that's just, it highlights, like I said, in the scientific method, those two studies highlight for us, these are the two basic ways that human beings try to assess truth. We can't just observe to determine truth because your senses can be fooled. We have to test. And the human brain, one of the features of higher intelligence, is it doesn't just observe what's going on, it seeks to test what's going on. When you were a little kid, I want you to imagine, don't try to imagine being a kid again. Some of us are way too old for that. But I want you to imagine you got a group of kids. Okay, and my nephew Mason just had his 10th birthday party, so I know my sister, who's listening to this, I hope, can probably relate to this. Let's say you got 10 kids in a room, and on this table you put a plate of chocolate chip cookies, and right next to it, a plate of raw, uncooked broccoli. And you tell the kids, okay, I'm gonna go outside for a minute. You can have all the chocolate chip cookies you want, but don't touch the broccoli. And then you leave. I promise you, when you come back to that room, there are going to be a few pieces of broccoli missing. Okay? Because the human brain is hardwired not only to observe its surroundings, but to test its surroundings. And those who attempt to ascertain truth only through observation, like the left, what that is a sign of is intellectual sloth. I don't want to think, I just want to feel. Let me sit back and you just let the stimulus wash over me. I'm going to lay back and do nothing, and you just keep feeding me stimulus, and I'll feel about it rather than think. All right? And the internet has also, this is one of the ways the internet has been bad. We don't have to go looking for information very much. Everything's at the click of a mouse, okay? So it's important in this day and age, it's more important than ever for people to really understand how we ascertain truth and how truth can't be ascertained, okay? So anyway, back to what I'm saying, okay, man, what a tangent that was. What was I talking about? Oh, the Democrats started this fourth generation war that we're in over 100 years ago, but it was very slowly by degrees. They didn't burn us in the fires of a nuclear bomb. They've been boiling us like a frog. Now, the frog never notices it's boiling because the water just gets a little bit hotter, a little bit hotter, a little bit hotter, and before the frog knows it, it's dead. Okay, that's how the Democrats have been operating for over 100 years. Ever since the abolition of slavery kind of broke their stranglehold on power, they've been trying to spin and spin and spin everything, okay, and keep us feeling like they're working for our best interests, when really all they're doing is securing more of a grip. Okay, watch Dinesh D'Souza's documentaries. I know I've said that before. You really need to do it. The plantation, the slave quarter that every plantation had, there was a place where all the slaves lived. Okay, that was just replaced by the Democrats with inner cities, like I was talking about, the big city bosses. And it's just, instead of cotton or tobacco, they put blacks to work as slaves harvesting votes. Okay, there was a Facebook page years ago called Just Statist Things that was great. Anybody could submit a Just Statist Things meme. I had one of LBJ pointing his finger right at the camera. And his quote when he said, with these welfare programs, he said, "I'll have those niggers voting Democratic for the next 200 years." Right? And then my caption underneath was, "Farming votes instead of cotton. Just Statist Things." Hell, I mean, look what's gone on in Washington since 2016. From media collaboration with the Democratic Party in spreading rampant disinformation and propaganda, pursuant to forwarding false, just hoax after hoax in their ongoing efforts to delegitimize this president, to collaborating with foreign powers to delegitimize this president, to encouraging citizens to use violence against political rivals. Here, look at this.
You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about. That's why I believe if we are fortunate enough to win back the House and/or the Senate, that's when civility can start again. But until then, the only thing that the Republicans seem to recognize and respect is strength.
Individuals who have banded together, ordinary people who simply saw what needed to be done and came together and supported those ideals, who have made the difference. They've marched, they've bled. Yes, some of them have died. This is hard. Every good thing is. We have done this before, we can do this again.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
If that's not fourth generation warfare, what is? Especially that clip of Maxine Waters. That drives me crazy. You know what that is? That's somebody stirring up a brute squad. Go back in medieval times, there was always a brute squad where they just, let's get a bunch of drunken, thugs and dock workers and everything we can get stirred up and send them at the house of the politician or the business owner that we're trying to get to go our way on a certain deal, right? They'd send somebody down to be a malingerer that would stir everybody up and convince an angry mob, this is the person to blame, let's go fuck them up, That's exactly what that is. That's exactly what Mad Maxine Waters is doing in that clip. So my point is, any fourth generation warfare tactics that we as private citizens engage in now, we are at least adhering to the non-aggression principle. Non-aggression principle wise, Brian, we are morally clear. We neither started nor chose this fight. We did not choose this war. They started it and it chose us. But Brian's question really was concerning the federal government's response to these kind of tactics. Well, to expand or build a bit on what I said last time, when you play against a bad chess player enough, you'll start to notice that both, their openers, their opening moves, and their responses to any kind of pressure you put on them are always the same. They always do the same thing to start, and then as soon as you start threatening their queen or moving into position to put them in check, they always have the same kind of response. And it won't always be the same moves necessarily, but they'll tend to go to the same pieces, and they'll tend to respond with the same timing and speed. Okay? And that the same thing happens here. People who don't know what they're doing always react. They never act. These authoritarian statists, the left, just like a bad chess player, always fire the same opening salvo. We're all in this together. There's a crisis you need us to fix. It's for the children. Won't someone think of the children? This is a problem that needs addressed now. Okay? And then when that gambit is challenged or threatened, when you put the least bit of pressure on them, they always respond the same way. What does the state do? What does a totalitarian state do in warfare once they're under the gun? Rationing, bans, disarmament, and in the case of an unruly public, increasing presence of enforcers. Right? For God's sake, look at Nancy Pelosi. Speaker Pelosi, do you hate President Trump? I resent you accusing me of that and blah, blah, blah. He didn't accuse her of anything, and he said that. I'm not accusing you. Oh, yes, you are. Yes, you did. Okay, that's a straw man. That is not what he fucking did. Then what does she do? And very next thing, I just happen to think that Donald Trump is a coward when it comes to dealing with this. And okay, that's an ad hominem attack. It's just like when you're debating some idiot on Facebook or Twitter The moment you give them an argument and they have no response, which is any time you give them an argument, because the only good response to an argument is a counter-argument, which is itself an argument, and leftists don't deal in those. So as soon as they get squeezed the tiniest little bit, it's the same 1-2 punch combination. Ad hom, straw man. Ad hom, straw man. I resent you accusing me of hate. He didn't accuse her of hate, but that's how she's misconstruing his argument, which is straw manning him. And then I don't hate Trump, I just think he's cowardly about dealing with this, this, and this. Okay, that's an ad hominem attack. That's attacking someone's character instead of their positions. If you want a great illustration of what a fucking cult these people are, all right, just like I just said, that same strategy, and I use the term loosely, employed by governments, totalitarian states in war, is what you get from Justice Democrats, feminists, and everybody. You know, it's just like on social media. Okay, Andrea, remember your vegan cyclist buddy? Okay, how does it start? We're all in this together. The government is us. There's a crisis. We need us, the government, the state, our dear leaders to fix. That's always their opening argument. You challenge it. You come, well, I don't think that's the best way to deal with this because of this, this, and this. You just don't care enough. There's your ad hom. Their openers are always the same. It's for the children. This is my truth. Feelings are the next best thing to spirit. Blah, 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 blah. And then when it's challenged, here's why you have no right to speak about this because of your identity, your privilege, your biases. Ad hominem attacks. You don't care about sick people. You don't care about children. You don't care about immigrants. Ad hom, ad hom, ad hom. And here's the big stupid funnel category that your argument falls into, which is a straw man argument. Okay, you're the wrong person to say anything, and what you just said is fascist. That's an ad hom and a straw man. Ad homs and straw men are their verbal means of disarmament and bans. You are the wrong person to say anything here, which is an attempt to silence you. A ban. And that argument is really this other argument, which everyone already knows is bad and hence is invalid. All right, it's a statement of white privilege, which otherizes this group unfairly, or that argument or language is literally violence. And that's disarmament. It's taking away your argument through misconstruing or misclassifying it, invalidating it, putting it in a category that's not allowed. Saying that Christian bakers should have the right to refuse to do business that they find immoral is fascism, is exactly the same as calling any gun you don't like an assault weapon to make it sound like something much worse than it is. Saying that AR in AR-15 stands for assault rifle, even though that doesn't mean anything, just like what the totalitarians in charge of a communist government would do. Ban and disarm. Ad hominem and straw man. It's the same thing. That's both how simplistic the left is, how anti-logic the left is, and how cult-like the left is. Right there. And then what the next step is the increasing police presence of enforcers. Now at the micro scale, with every leftist you've ever triggered on Facebook running off and reporting you to an admin to get you banned or get your account suspended. This is the cyber version of having you arrested for thought crime. And now you have to defend what you said and prove the negative. You have to prove a negative that it wasn't something fascist. It's like when it's Kafka trapping. It's like when someone calls you a racist. Prove you're not a racist. And they make fun of you if you say, well, I have black friends. Like, that's not a completely valid response to being called a racist. They just, it's this programmed NPC subroutine to laugh at people who point out that, oh, by the way, I'm married to a black person, okay, like, or whatever it is, right? Okay, well, Brian, it's worth considering what's the next step after that. Once the bans and the disarmament and the increased police presence have failed, once those things have proven ineffective at the macro scale, when people won't give up their guns, when people won't shut their mouths or obey speech codes or pay a given tax, what does the state do next? That's right. It institutes martial law or a police state, like in Venezuela. Well, at the micro scale, that's the little cultists that one encounters on Facebook or Twitter pushing for full censorship or net neutrality or bandwidth rationing or Burnout's brilliant new proposal to declare the internet a public utility. In Bernie's case, once again, proving that you can take the pipsqueak out of the playground, but you can't take the playground out of the pipsqueak. Again, and I know you will, Brian, because you have little choice, look to Virginia. And hey, man, don't feel alone. Right now, we are all watching Virginia like a squadron of hawks. All right, so I think that's it for today. Back with another episode in a couple weeks, everybody. Merry Christmas to you and yours, and thank you very much for tuning in. Thanks.
I'm a man who discovered the wheel and built the Eiffel Tower out of metal and brawn. That's what kind of man I am. You're just a woman with a small brain. With a brain a third the size of us. It's science.